Harlem, October 1939, 7:04 p.m. The streetlights along Lenox Avenue flickered awake one by one, their yellow glow stretching across wet pavement like tired fingers. The day's heat had settled into the bricks, and the evening carried the smell of coal smoke, roasted peanuts, and rain that had passed through earlier but never quite left. Inside a narrow brownstone halfway down the block, the Carter family sat around a kitchen table that had already seen too many long nights. The table was small, scratched, leaning slightly to one side where one leg had been repaired twice. On it sat three things: a stack of folded bills, a chipped porcelain coffee cup, and a small leather notebook that didn't belong to anyone in the room. Mrs. Carter kept her hands folded in her lap, her fingers twisted against each other slowly, the way someone does when they're trying not to show fear. Across from her sat a man in a gray overcoat. He wasn't large. He wasn't loud. But he carried himself like someone who had practiced patience the way other men practiced violence. His name was Raymond Pike. Around Harlem, people had other names for him: Lone Man, Collector, Leech, but never to his face. He flipped open the leather notebook and ran a finger down the page slowly. $22, he said calmly. His voice was smooth, almost polite. Mr. Carter swallowed. That's everything we could get this week. Pike nodded as if he had expected exactly that answer. He reached forward, pulled the small stack of bills closer, and counted them with slow fingers. 1, 2, 3. Each bill smoothed carefully against the table. The silence in the room stretched longer with every count. When he finished, Pike closed the notebook and leaned back slightly in his chair. 22, he repeated. Mrs. Carter forced a smile that didn't quite form. It's honest money. Oh, I believe that, Pike said softly. His eyes moved around the kitchen, the cracked wallpaper, the stove that hissed faintly in the corner, the two small bedrooms down the hallway where the Carter children had been told to stay quiet tonight. Pike reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pencil. He opened the notebook again. Now, he said, let's see what that does to the balance. The pencil scratched slowly across paper. Mr. Carter watched every movement like a man watching someone measure his coffin. Pike finished writing. Then he turned the notebook around. After tonight, he said calmly, your remaining balance is $193. Mrs. Carter blinked. That can't be right. Mr. Carter leaned forward. We borrowed $80. Yes. And we've already paid. Interest. Pike interrupted gently. The word landed in the room like a dropped coin. Mr. Carter's jaw tightened. Pike spoke again, patient as a teacher correcting a slow student. You borrowed $80 6 weeks ago. Yes. You've paid 112 cents. Mr. Carter nodded slowly. So the debt should be finished. Pike shook his head. No, Mr. Carter. The debt has barely begun. He tapped the notebook. The weekly interest is 30%. Mrs. Carter gasped quietly. That's impossible. Not impossible, Pike said. Just expensive. Mr. Carter stared at the numbers. You never said it would grow like that. Pike smiled slightly. I said the terms were clear. They weren't. Pike closed the notebook again. Slowly. Mr. Carter, he said. When a man takes money he cannot repay, the details tend to sort themselves out later. The words were soft, but their meaning pressed against the walls of the kitchen. Mrs. Carter leaned forward. We're trying, she said. I can see that. Then why does the number keep going up? Pike looked at her for a moment, not cruelly, just with the distant patience of someone observing weather. Because that's how this works. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Mr. Carter ran a hand over his face. I drive a delivery truck 12 hours a day. I know. My wife takes laundry from 3 buildings. I know that too. Then you know we're not hiding money. Pike nodded. I don't believe you are. Then why keep doing this? Pike leaned forward. Because this part always mattered. This, he said calmly, tapping the table, is business. He stood slowly. The chair legs scraped against the floor. Next Friday, he said. sliding the notebook back into his coat pocket. The balance will be $250. Mrs. Carter stared at him. That's impossible. Not if you keep paying. And if we can't? Pike shrugged lightly. Then we adjust. Mr. Carter's eyes narrowed. Adjust how? Pike buttoned his coat. Well, his gaze drifted down the hallway toward the bedrooms. There are always arrangements. The room went very still. Mrs. Carter's voice dropped. You leave our children out of this. Pike held up a hand. Relax. But the word carried no comfort. I'm simply saying debts have ways of resolving themselves. Mr. Carter stood slowly now. The chair scraped again. You got your money tonight. Yes. Then leave. Pike smiled. That's the idea. He walked toward the door. Before stepping outside, he paused. One more thing. Mr. Carter said nothing. Pike turned slightly. Missing payments makes the interest enthusiastic. The door closed behind him. The Carter kitchen remained silent long after his footsteps disappeared down the sidewalk. Mrs. Carter finally covered her face with both hands. Oh God! Mr. Carter stayed standing. His fists were tight at his sides. He stared at the door like it might open again. From the hallway, a small voice spoke. Is he gone? Their son Daniel stepped into the kitchen doorway. 10 years old. Thin. Too quiet for his age. Mr. Carter forced a smile. He's gone. Daniel looked at the table. Did we pay him? Mrs. Carter wiped her eyes quickly. Yes. Then why do you both look like that? Mr. Carter didn't answer. Because children sometimes understand things adults wish they didn't. Daniel looked at the empty chair where Pike had been sitting. Is he coming back? Mr. Carter hesitated, then nodded. Yes. When? Next week. Daniel thought about that. Then he asked a question no parent ever wants to hear. Will we ever finish paying him? The kitchen clock ticked again. Mr. Carter didn't know the answer. Outside, Harlem continued moving the way it always did. Men argued over dominoes in a barbershop 2 doors down. A trumpet cried through an open window on 134th Street. A woman laughed loudly somewhere in the night. Life continued. But inside certain apartments, like the Carter home, something quieter was happening. Debt was settling in like winter. And Raymond Pike was not the only man in Harlem who understood how winter worked. 2 blocks away, in a smoke-filled back room behind a numbers office, 3 men sat around another table. Their conversation moved slowly, carefully, the kind of talk that never needed to be loud. One of them finally leaned forward. You hear about Pike? Another man nodded. Which family this time? Carter's. The third man frowned. Delivery driver? Yeah. That man ain't got nothing. Pike don't care. The room fell quiet. Then someone said something that changed the air completely. Bumpy ain't heard yet. The other 2 men exchanged a look. Because Harlem had many kinds of men. Hustlers, dreamers, survivors. And then there were the few who understood the neighborhood differently. Men who didn't speak often. Men who didn't rush decisions. Men who carried Harlem's memory in the way they walked. Some debts could last forever. But some debts had a way of reaching the wrong ears. And when that happened, the calendar usually began counting down. Not up. For days would pass before a certain knock arrived on a certain door. But on this night, Harlem didn't know that yet. For now, the city simply breathed. And somewhere across those quiet streets, a man named Bumpy Johnson was finishing his dinner, unaware that a small kitchen table and a desperate family had just been added to the long list of things Harlem expected him to understand. Harlem, October 1939, 10:26 p.m. The night had settled into its usual rhythm. Music slipped from open windows along 7th Avenue, soft trumpet notes drifting through the cool air like smoke. Taxi tires whispered across wet pavement. Somewhere down the block a woman laughed loudly, the kind of laugh that meant she had already decided tomorrow could worry about itself. Harlem did not sleep early. It breathed, it watched, and it remembered. At the corner of 138th and Lenox stood a narrow storefront with a striped awning that had faded unevenly from too many summers. The sign above the window read Lewis Barber Shop, though most men simply called it Lewis Place. Inside, the chairs were full. A radio hummed quietly behind the counter, playing a slow blues number that carried more feeling than volume. Hair clippers buzzed steadily as Mr. Lewis moved with careful precision around a customer's head. Men sat along the wall waiting their turn, hats resting on their knees. Conversation moved through the room the way it always did. Slow, layered, never rushed. One man leaned back in his chair. "You hear about Pike again?" The name floated across the room like a bad smell. Another man nodded. "Yeah. Carter's." A third man frowned slightly. "That driver on Lennox?" "Same one." Mr. Lewis kept cutting hair, but his eyes shifted slightly in the mirror. "What Pike do now?" he asked. "Same thing he always does." The man speaking shook his head. "Man took $80. Now says they owe $200. Someone whistled quietly. "That ain't lending," another man muttered. "That's hunting." A low rumble of agreement passed through the room. Harlem had always understood debt. People borrowed from neighbors, cousins, church friends. Money moved hand to hand when times got tight. But there was a difference between helping someone survive and watching them drown. Raymond Pike did not believe in the first kind. Mr. Lewis wiped his razor clean. "Family got kids?" "Two." The barber paused for just a moment, then continued shaving carefully along the customer's jaw. "That man keeps pushing," someone said quietly. "He been pushing. But this one's different." "Why?" The man speaking leaned forward. "Because the whole block sees it." Silence filled the shop for a moment. In Harlem, certain things mattered more than others. Respect, fairness, and the quiet understanding that people survived by protecting each other when the world outside didn't bother trying. Loan sharks existed. Everyone knew that. But there were lines. And Raymond Pike had started stepping over them. One of the younger men in the shop finally asked the question that had been sitting in the room the whole time. "Bumpy hear about it yet?" The room grew quieter. Mr. Lewis turned the razor in his hand slowly. "No," he said. "How you know?" The barber wiped the blade against a towel. "Because if he had..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood what the rest of that thought looked like. 2 blocks away, a different kind of room held a different kind of conversation. The Savoy ballroom had already begun filling with dancers. The music inside carried energy that pushed people out onto the polished floor like gravity. Brass horns blazed. Piano keys rattled. Shoes slid and spun across wood worn smooth by thousands of nights just like this one. At a small table near the wall sat a man who wasn't dancing. He wore a dark suit that fit comfortably without trying too hard. A hat rested beside his glass. His posture was relaxed. But the space around him remained slightly open, even in a crowded room. Because people recognized him. They didn't stare. They didn't whisper loudly. They simply noticed. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat quietly, watching the room the way some men watched a chessboard. Across from him sat a man named Walter Gaines. Walter handled small pieces of Harlem's everyday business. Number slips, collections, favors, introductions. Nothing dramatic. Just the machinery that kept things moving. Walter leaned forward slightly. "Busy night." Bumpy nodded once. "Music's good." They watched the dancers for a moment. Then Walter spoke again. "You hear about Pike?" Bumpy picked up his glass slowly. "No." Walter waited a moment before continuing. "He's leaning on another family." Bumpy took a small sip. "What family?" "Carter's." Bumpy's eyes moved briefly toward the bandstand. "Delivery driver?" Walter nodded. "That's the one." "How much?" "Started at 80. Bumpy's gaze returned to the dancers. "And now?" "Close to 200. The trumpet player hit a long note that filled the room like a rising tide. Bumpy said nothing for a moment. Walter studied him carefully. Because the thing about Bumpy Johnson was simple. He didn't rush reactions. Most men got loud when they heard bad news. Bumpy got quiet. Finally he spoke. "People see it?" Walter nodded. "Whole block." "And Pike knows they see it?" "Don't think he cares." Bumpy rested one arm on the table. Men who don't care about being watched, he said calmly, usually forget who's doing the watching. Walter gave a small smile. That's one way to say it. The band shifted songs. The rhythm slowed slightly. Couples moved closer together on the floor. Walter spoke again. You want me to handle it? Bumpy shook his head once. No. Why not? Bumpy looked at him. Because if I send someone, Pike learns nothing. Walter leaned back. So what's the plan? Bumpy finished his drink. Then he placed the glass down carefully. Nothing tonight. Walter blinked. Nothing? Nothing. Walter had known Bumpy long enough to understand what that word sometimes meant. When Bumpy said nothing, Harlem usually started paying closer attention. Across the neighborhood, the night continued unfolding in its ordinary ways. Restaurants served late plates of fried chicken and collard greens. Taxi horns barked along crowded avenues. Music drifted from basement clubs where men played saxophones like they were telling secrets. But small conversations had already begun moving through the neighborhood. Quiet ones. In barber shops. In hallways. On stoops where men smoked cigarettes and watched the street. The story of the Carter family passed from one voice to another. Always in calm tones. Never exaggerated. Harlem didn't need drama to understand injustice. The facts were enough. And somewhere in those quiet conversations, one name always appeared sooner or later. Bumpy. Not shouted. Not demanded. Just spoken like a possibility. Inside the Carter apartment, the lights were off. Mrs. Carter sat alone at the kitchen table where Raymond Pike had counted the money earlier. The empty coffee cup was still there. The chair he had used remained slightly pushed back from the table. She stared at the surface of the wood where the bills had been stacked. Her husband had gone to bed hours earlier, exhaustion pulling him under the moment his head touched the pillow. But she couldn't sleep, because numbers had started circling in her mind like birds over water. $80. 112 paid. 193 still owed. Next week, 250. The math made no sense, which meant the truth was simple. There was no end. She rubbed her hands together slowly. Then she whispered a prayer too quiet for anyone else to hear. Not for money, not for miracles, just for the kind of help that sometimes appeared when people stopped expecting it. Across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson stepped out of the Savoy Ballroom and into the cool October air. The streetlights painted long shadows across the sidewalk. Walter stood beside him. You heading home? Bumpy adjusted his coat. For now. Walter nodded. And Pike? Bumpy paused for a moment. Then he looked down Lenox Avenue, where the street stretched into darkness. Men like Pike, he said calmly, usually believe Harlem belongs to whoever scares it the most. Walter waited. Bumpy's voice stayed quiet. They forget something. What's that? Bumpy began walking. That Harlem remembers who protects it. Walter watched him disappear down the street. And for the first time that night, the neighborhood had begun counting days. Harlem, October 1940, 11:18 a.m. Morning sunlight spilled across Lenox Avenue, bouncing off storefront windows and warming the sidewalks where shopkeepers had already begun their routines. A man swept dust from the entrance of a tailor shop. A delivery truck rattled past, its wooden sides creaking with every bump in the road. Women walked in pairs carrying market bags filled with vegetables and bread. Harlem moved like it always did, steady, watchful, alive. And 3 floors above the street, Raymond Pike sat comfortably behind a wide wooden desk, counting money. The office wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. Power rarely required decoration. A single window looked down toward the avenue. The blinds were tilted just enough to let light through without letting anyone outside see too much of the room. On the desk sat 3 stacks of cash. Pike finished counting the first stack, tapped the edges straight, and slid it neatly beside the other 2. Then he leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Business had been good. Very good. Across from the desk stood a tall man in a dark coat, hat resting low on his forehead. His name was Calvin Reeves, though most people simply called him Cal. Cal handled collections, which meant he was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice often. His presence usually did the work. "You going back to the Carters today?" Pike asked. Cal nodded. "They owe again." Pike smiled faintly. "They always owe." Cal didn't laugh. He had seen too many kitchens that looked exactly like the Carter home. Small tables, tired parents, children pretending not to hear adult conversations. But his job didn't involve sympathy. "How much they bringing?" Pike asked. "Not sure yet. Make sure it's enough." Cal shifted slightly. "They're running out." Pike waved a dismissive hand. "People always say that. And sometimes they mean it." Pike leaned forward now. "Then they find more." Cal said nothing, because in Raymond Pike's world, there were only two kinds of people: those who owed money, and those who collected it. The middle didn't exist. Pike reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the familiar leather notebook. He flipped through several pages filled with careful numbers. Each name carried a story. Some paid quickly, some struggled, some disappeared, but they all ended the same way: profit. Pike tapped the page where the Carter name sat. "You know what the trick is?" he said calmly. Cal looked up. "What?" "Hope." Cal frowned slightly. Pike continued. "You let them believe they're close to freedom." He tapped the notebook again. "They think one more payment might finish it." "But it doesn't," Cal said. "Of course not." Pike smiled. "Because if the debt ever ends, the business ends." Cal folded his arms. "And if they stop paying?" Pike's smile faded slightly. "Then we remind them." The office door opened quietly. Another man stepped inside, shorter, nervous-looking, carrying a folded piece of paper. "Mr. Pike." "Yes." "The tailor on 132nd paid early." Pike held out his hand. The man passed him the money. Pike counted it quickly. "Good." He slipped it into one of the stacks on the desk. "See?" he said, glancing at Cal. "Everyone finds a way eventually." But outside that office, Harlem was beginning to notice patterns. People always noticed patterns. At Lewis' barber shop, the conversation returned to the same subject again that morning. Pike sent his man back to the Carters. Mr. Lewis looked up from his clippers. "Already?" "Yeah." "That man don't waste time." Another customer shook his head. "He ain't collecting." "What you mean?" "He's squeezing." The room filled with quiet agreement, because everyone understood the difference. Collection meant finishing a debt. Squeezing meant making sure it never finished. One of the younger men leaned forward. "You think Bumpy's going to step in?" Mr. Lewis wiped hair from his razor. "If he decides it matters." "And if he doesn't?" The barber shrugged. "Then Pike keeps doing what Pike does." 2 blocks away, the Carter apartment looked even smaller in daylight. Mr. Carter sat at the kitchen table, staring at a few folded bills. $21. That was everything left after rent, groceries, and the small amount his wife had managed to save from washing laundry all week. Mrs. Carter stood by the sink, hands still damp from washing dishes. "He'll be here soon," she said quietly. Mr. Carter nodded. "I know. What if we don't have enough?" He didn't answer, because both of them already understood the truth. There was never enough. A knock came at the door. 3 slow taps. Cal Reeves stepped inside without waiting long. He removed his hat politely. "Morning." Mr. Carter stood. "That all you got?" Cal asked, looking at the money on the table. 21. Cal sighed slightly. "That ain't going to help much." "It's everything." Cal walked closer to the table. He looked around the apartment. Same cracked walls. Same worn chairs. Same quiet hallway where children stayed hidden. "Mr. Pike says the balance went up again." "How much now?" 220. Mrs. Carter's shoulders dropped. "That's impossible." Cal shrugged. "Interest." Mr. Carter pushed the money toward him. "Take it." Cal didn't reach for it immediately. "You know what Pike's going to say." "I don't care what he says." Cal studied him carefully. "You should." Because men who borrowed from Raymond Pike rarely stopped hearing his voice. Across Harlem, word of the Carter situation kept traveling. Slowly, quietly, until eventually it reached the one place where certain problems stopped spreading and started ending. A narrow office above a numbers parlor on 135th Street. Bumpy Johnson sat by the window reading a newspaper. Walter Gaines stood nearby, flipping through betting slips. "You hear the latest?" Walter asked. Bumpy lowered the paper slightly. "About Pike." Walter nodded. "Sent his collector back this morning." "How much now?" 220. Bumpy folded the newspaper carefully. "And the family?" "Still paying." Bumpy looked out the window. Below them, Harlem moved through another ordinary afternoon. Children ran along the sidewalk chasing a rubber ball. A woman argued with a fruit vendor about the price of apples. A police car rolled slowly past, ignored by most people. Walter waited. "What you thinking?" Bumpy's voice remained calm. "I'm thinking Pike believes no one's watching." Walter nodded slowly. "And?" Bumpy stood. "Men who believe that usually learn something." "What?" Bumpy put on his coat. "That Harlem watches everything." Walter studied him. "You planning to talk to him?" Bumpy paused at the door. "Not today." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Then when?" Bumpy adjusted his hat. "When he's comfortable enough to forget he should be worried." Walter smiled slightly. "4 days." Bumpy didn't answer, but the quiet look in his eyes told Walter something important. Raymond Pike believed he controlled the clock, but Harlem had already started counting. And somewhere between those days, a certain knock was getting closer. Harlem, October 1940. Day 1, 8:03 a.m. The morning arrived quietly. Sunlight crept across the rooftops along Lenox Avenue, touching brick and glass the same way it had every morning before it. Milk carts rattled down the street. Newspaper boys shouted headlines that most people barely listened to anymore. Harlem woke slowly, but under that ordinary rhythm something else had started moving. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the subtle shift that happened whenever Bumpy Johnson decided to think about something. And thinking for Bumpy was never rushed. He sat at a small corner table inside a restaurant on 135th Street, stirring coffee that had already cooled. Across from him sat Walter Gaines. Walter had known Bumpy long enough to recognize the signs. When Bumpy talked a lot, nothing serious was happening. When Bumpy talked less, something was coming. Walter finally leaned forward. "You planning to see Pike today?" Bumpy shook his head once. "No." Walter nodded slowly. "What about tomorrow?" "Maybe." The answer wasn't really an answer, but that was the way Bumpy worked. He believed in timing. A man could solve problems with fists or guns if he wanted to, but those solutions rarely lasted. Real power came from something else. Understanding when someone believed they were safe. Outside the restaurant window, Harlem passed by in slow motion. Men in work coats headed toward construction jobs downtown. Women carried baskets of laundry between apartment buildings. A group of children chased each other along the sidewalk, laughing loudly enough to make 2 old men on a nearby bench shake their heads. Life continued, but word had already started traveling through the neighborhood. Bumpy had heard about Pike, and that meant something. At Lewis' barber shop, the conversation returned to the same subject for the 3rd time that morning. Mr. Lewis wiped his razor clean. "You hear anything yet?" A man in the waiting chair shook his head. "Nothing." Another man spoke up. "Bumpy usually moves faster than this." Mr. Lewis looked at him through the mirror. "Not always." "What you mean?" The barber placed a towel carefully around his customer's neck. "Sometimes silence is the first move." The younger men in the shop exchanged looks, because Harlem had learned something about Bumpy Johnson over the years. When he rushed, people got nervous. When he stayed calm, people started paying attention. Across town, Raymond Pike believed everything was proceeding exactly as planned. His office window was open slightly now, letting in the cool autumn air. Pike sat behind his desk reviewing the notebook that held the Carter family's growing debt. $220. The number looked good on paper. Better than good. Profitable. Cal Reeves stood nearby. "They gave 21 this morning." Pike wrote the number down. And the new balance? Cal hesitated. 243. Pike nodded. See. Cal frowned. See what? They always find money. Cal leaned against the wall. That family's breaking. Pike looked up. And they got kids. Pike's pencil paused. For a moment he seemed almost annoyed by the interruption. Then he shrugged. People with children should borrow less. Cal didn't respond. Because arguing with Raymond Pike was like arguing with winter. It never changed the temperature. Pike closed the notebook. We'll give them another week. Cal raised an eyebrow. That's generous. Pike smiled faintly. Not generous. He tapped the desk. Strategic. Cal didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. Fear grew better when watered slowly. Day 2, 9:41 p.m. The night air carried music from the Savoy Ballroom again. Couples filled the dance floor beneath the bright lights, their movements quick and joyful. The band pushed the rhythm faster. Shoes tapped and spun across polished wood. At a table near the back wall, Bumpy Johnson sat quietly once more. Walter leaned closer so the music wouldn't swallow his words. You've been quiet 2 days now. Bumpy nodded. Walter studied him. You know Pike's still collecting. Yes. And you're letting him. Bumpy looked at the dancers. Letting? Walter waited. Bumpy spoke calmly. Men like Pike build confidence the longer they believe no one is coming. Walter smiled slightly. You giving him rope? Something like that. Walter took a sip from his glass. Whole neighborhood's watching. Bumpy nodded once. That's important. Why? Bumpy turned his head slightly. So they understand the difference between noise and control. Walter leaned back. That's a lesson Pike probably won't enjoy. Bumpy didn't answer. But the calm expression on his face said enough. Day 3, 6:18 p.m. The Carter apartment had grown quieter. Not because the problem had disappeared, but because exhaustion had replaced panic. Mr. Carter sat at the kitchen table again, staring at another small pile of bills. $15 this time. Mrs. Carter placed 2 plates of food on the table. Soup, bread, nothing else. Cal came again today, she said softly. Mr. Carter nodded. What did he say? Same thing he always says. Mr. Carter rubbed his eyes. How much now? $260. The number hung in the air like smoke. Mr. Carter laughed once. Not happily, just tired. That ain't a debt anymore. Mrs. Carter sat down slowly. What is it then? He looked at the table. A trap. Neither of them spoke for a while. In the hallway, their son Daniel tried to read a schoolbook while pretending he wasn't listening. Children learn things faster than adults realized. Day 4, 8:52 p.m. Raymond Pike poured himself a drink. Whiskey. Cheap but strong. His office looked exactly the same as it had the previous nights. Stacks of money. The leather notebook. The quiet satisfaction of a man who believed his system worked perfectly. Cal stood by the window. You hear anything? Pike glanced up. About what? Johnson. Pike chuckled. Bumpy Johnson? Cal nodded. Pike leaned back in his chair. That man's got bigger problems than my little loans. Cal watched him carefully. You sure about that? Pike waved the thought away. I've been running this business 2 years. So if Johnson cared, he would have shown up already. Cal didn't answer, because the truth about Bumpy Johnson was something Raymond Pike had not yet learned. Bumpy rarely rushed. He waited, and when the moment finally arrived, it arrived completely. Pike raised his glass. To another profitable week. Outside his window, Harlem continued breathing. Music drifted from open club doors. Taxi lights glowed along the avenue. And 4 quiet days of silence reached their end. 2 blocks away, Bumpy Johnson finished buttoning his coat. Walter watched from the office doorway. You ready? Bumpy nodded. Walter smiled faintly. Whole neighborhood's been waiting. Bumpy adjusted his hat. Good. Walter crossed his arms. You want company? Bumpy shook his head once. No. You sure? Bumpy's voice stayed calm. This conversation only needs one voice. Walter opened the door. The cool night air rolled in from the street below. Bumpy stepped into it without hesitation. Behind him, Walter called out one last question. You planning to scare him? Bumpy paused halfway down the stairs. Then he answered quietly. No. Walter frowned. Then what? Bumpy continued walking. I'm planning to teach him something. Outside, Harlem's lights reflected off rain-soaked pavement. And somewhere across those streets, Raymond Pike still believed the night would end like every other. He believed his door would stay closed. He believed the system he built would keep working forever. But in Harlem, certain lessons arrived slowly, and certain knocks carried more weight than others. The clock moved toward midnight, and Bumpy Johnson had started walking. Harlem, October 1940, 11:47 p.m. The streets had quieted. Not completely, Harlem never slept that deeply, but the loud parts of the night had softened into something slower. Music still leaked from distant club doors. A taxi rolled past every few minutes. Somewhere down the avenue a trumpet cried through an open window. But most storefront lights were dark. Most apartment windows had dimmed. And Raymond Pike sat alone in his office finishing his drink. The whiskey glass rested near the edge of his desk. The leather notebook lay open beside it, its pages filled with the careful handwriting that had built his business. Numbers, names, balances. Pike turned one of the pages slowly. He enjoyed this part, looking at the proof. Debt written neatly in ink always felt more permanent than the messy conversations that created it. He ran a finger down the Carter entry again. Balance, $263. A small smile crossed his face. Profitable, reliable, exactly the kind of account that kept his system working. Outside the window, a cold wind pushed down Lenox Avenue, rattling the loose metal frames slightly. Pike closed the notebook. Midnight was getting close. Time to go home. He stood, stretching his shoulders slowly after a long day behind the desk. The room smelled faintly of cigar smoke and cheap whiskey. Then came the sound. 3 slow knocks. Not loud, not aggressive, just deliberate. Pike paused. Visitors this late were unusual. Collectors usually finished their work hours ago, and men who owed money rarely came voluntarily after dark. The knock came again. 3 taps. Exactly the same rhythm. Pike frowned slightly and walked toward the door. When he opened it, the hallway light revealed a man standing calmly in the doorway. Dark suit, overcoat buttoned neatly, hat resting low but not hiding the face. Raymond Pike blinked once. Because even men who pretended not to pay attention to Harlem knew certain faces. Evening, the man said quietly. Pike cleared his throat. Mr. Johnson. Bumpy Johnson stood still in the hallway. No bodyguards. No crowd. Just the quiet presence that had made his name carry weight across the neighborhood. I was in the area, Bumpy said. Pike forced a polite smile. Well, come in. Bumpy stepped inside. His eyes moved around the room slowly. Desk, window, chairs, stacks of money neatly arranged. The leather notebook. He removed his hat and placed it gently on the corner of the desk. Nice office, he said. Pike closed the door behind him. Thank you. The air inside the room had changed. Pike could feel it immediately, because power sometimes entered a room without raising its voice. Can I get you a drink? Pike asked. Bumpy shook his head. No. Pike walked back toward his desk, trying to keep his movements casual. So, what brings you by? Bumpy remained standing. You've been busy. Pike sat down slowly. Business has been good. I hear that. Pike folded his hands. Well, Harlem's full of opportunity. Bumpy nodded slightly. Yes. He stepped closer to the desk. And full of families. Pike's smile tightened. I'm not sure what you mean. Bumpy looked at the leather notebook. Carter's. The name landed in the room like a dropped coin. Pike leaned back slightly in his chair. Oh, that. Yes. They borrowed money. I know. They agreed to the terms. Bumpy's voice stayed calm. What terms? Pike reached for the notebook. 30% weekly interest. Bumpy raised an eyebrow. Weekly? That's correct. And the loan was $80. Yes. And now the balance is? Pike opened the notebook. 263. Bumpy studied the page. Then he closed the notebook gently with his hand. That's impressive. Pike relaxed slightly. Business requires discipline. Bumpy pulled a chair out and sat down across from him. You know something about Harlem? Pike nodded. I'd say I do. Bumpy rested his hands on the table. Harlem survives by helping its own people. Pike shrugged. I'm helping them. Bumpy tilted his head slightly. Explain that. I give money to people who need it. And then, they repay it. Bumpy looked at him quietly. And when they can't? Pike's smile returned. They always can. Silence settled over the room. Not tense. Just heavy. Because both men understood something important now. This conversation wasn't about money. It was about rules. Bumpy leaned forward slightly. You've been in Harlem 2 years. That's right. And in those 2 years, nobody explained something to you. Pike's voice sharpened slightly. What's that? Bumpy spoke calmly. You can make money here. Pike nodded. That's exactly what I've been doing. Yes. Bumpy's eyes remained steady. But you can't bleed people dry. Pike leaned forward now. Mr. Johnson, with respect. Bumpy raised a hand. Not aggressively. Just enough to stop the sentence. Respect is exactly what we're talking about. Pike's jaw tightened. They borrowed money. Yes. They knew the interest. No. They signed nothing. Bumpy's tone didn't change. But the entire block knows what you're doing. Pike scoffed. The block doesn't run my business. Bumpy smiled faintly. No. He leaned back in his chair. But the block decides who stays. The words landed slowly. Pike looked toward the window. Then back to Bumpy. You threatening me? Bumpy shook his head. No. Then what is this? Bumpy reached for the notebook again. He opened it to the Carter page. Then he tore the sheet out carefully. Pike's eyes widened. Hey! Bumpy held up a finger. Pike stopped speaking. Because the calm in Bumpy's face made something very clear. Shouting would not help. Bumpy folded the paper once. Then again. Then placed it neatly in the center of the desk. That debt is finished. Pike stared at him. You can't just. I just did. Pike stood up. You don't control my books. Bumpy remained seated. No. He looked around the office slowly. But I do control Harlem. The room fell silent again. Pike's breathing had grown slightly faster now. You think you can just walk in here and... Bumpy stood. The movement was slow, unhurried, but it immediately changed the balance in the room. I walked in, he said quietly, and now I'm explaining the rules. Pike hesitated. Rules? Yes. Bumpy picked up his hat. If you lend money in Harlem, the debt ends when it's paid. Pike laughed nervously. That's not how lending works. Bumpy placed the hat on his head. In Harlem it does. Pike looked at the stacks of money on his desk. This is my business. Bumpy nodded. For tonight. Pike froze. The words hung in the air long enough to settle into meaning. For tonight? Pike asked. Bumpy walked toward the door. Then he stopped. One last look back. You have 2 choices. Pike didn't speak. You can close this office tomorrow and leave Harlem. Pike's voice came out tight. And if I don't? Bumpy opened the door. Then Harlem will close it for you. The hallway light spilled into the room again. Bumpy stepped through the doorway. Before leaving, he added one final sentence. Quiet, calm, unmistakable. And when Harlem closes something, it stays closed. The door shut softly behind him. Raymond Pike stood alone in the office. The stacks of money still sat neatly on the desk. The notebook remained open, but the page with the Carter family's name was gone. Outside, Bumpy Johnson walked down the dim hallway toward the street. The night air greeted him again as he stepped onto Lenox Avenue. Walter leaned against a parked car nearby. You finished. Bumpy nodded. Walter studied his face. How'd it go? Bumpy adjusted his coat. He understands. Walter smiled slightly. You sure? Bumpy began walking down the sidewalk. Yes. Walter fell into step beside him. And if he doesn't? Bumpy looked up the street where Harlem's lights stretched into the distance. Then tomorrow, he said calmly. Harlem will remind him. Behind them, Raymond Pike stood motionless in his office, staring at the torn page. And for the first time since opening his business, he wasn't thinking about profit. He was thinking about survival. Harlem, October 1940, 7:12 a.m. Morning arrived with the kind of quiet that follows a long night. The sky above Lenox Avenue carried a pale gray color, the sun still hidden behind rows of brick buildings. Store owners lifted metal shutters from their windows. Delivery carts rolled slowly along the sidewalks, wheels creaking with each turn. Harlem woke the way it always did. But something subtle had changed. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the quiet feeling that a problem had already ended before most people even knew how serious it had become. Inside Lewis' barber shop, Mr. Lewis flipped the sign on the door from closed to open. The bell above the door rang as the first customer stepped inside. Morning, Mr. Lewis draped a towel across the man's shoulders. The radio behind the counter hummed softly with a gospel program. For a few minutes, the conversation stayed ordinary. Weather, baseball, the price of eggs at the market. Then the door opened again. Walter Gaines stepped inside. Mr. Lewis looked at him through the mirror. You're out early. Walter smiled faintly. Somebody had to be. The men sitting along the wall watched quietly, because Walter rarely visited the shop before noon. Mr. Lewis lowered his voice slightly. You see him last night? Walter nodded once. The room became still. What happened? Someone asked. Walter shrugged lightly. Conversation. Mr. Lewis raised an eyebrow. That all? That's all it needed. One of the younger men leaned forward. And Pike. Walter took a seat in the waiting chair. Pike got an education. Mr. Lewis chuckled softly. About time. The younger man frowned. So what happens now? Walter leaned back. That depends on how well he listens. Across the neighborhood, Raymond Pike had barely slept. The office looked the same as it had the night before. Stacks of money, the notebook, the empty whiskey glass still sitting where he had left it. But Pike himself looked different. His jacket hung over the back of his chair. His eyes were tired, and the torn page from the Carter account sat folded neatly in his hand. He had unfolded it sometime during the night, stared at the numbers, then folded it again, over and over, because the problem wasn't the paper. It was the message that came with it. Pike stood and walked toward the window. Below, Harlem moved through another ordinary morning. People walked to work. Children hurried toward school. Taxi horns echoed down the street. Life continued. But Pike had begun to understand something that hadn't been obvious before. The neighborhood was watching him, not staring openly, not confronting him, just observing quietly, the same way Bumpy Johnson had observed him the night before. And that kind of attention carried consequences. The office door creaked open. Cal Reeves stepped inside. He looked at Pike carefully. You look tired. Pike didn't answer. Cal glanced at the desk. Johnson came by. It wasn't a question. Pike nodded once. Cal walked closer. What did he say? Pike held up the folded page. That the Carter debt's finished. Cal studied his face. And, Pike's voice came out slowly. And that I should close the office. Cal nodded thoughtfully. You going to? Pike looked around the room. 2 years of work sat on those shelves. Every ledger, every payment, every carefully calculated interest charge. It had taken patience to build, and patience to maintain. But something about the previous night kept echoing in his mind. Bumpy Johnson had never raised his voice, never threatened him directly, never even touched the money sitting on the desk. Yet the message had been unmistakable. Cal leaned against the wall. You know something about Harlem? Pike glanced at him. What? Cal spoke calmly. People here don't panic. So, they remember. Pike frowned slightly. Remember what? Cal shrugged. Who stands up for them? Silence filled the office. Pike looked at the torn page again. $263. A number that had felt powerful yesterday. Now it looked small, almost meaningless. Finally he spoke. Call the other borrowers. Cal blinked. What for? Pike folded the page one last time. Tell them their balances are finished. Cal stared at him. You serious? Yes. What about the money? Pike sighed. Money's easy to find. Cal waited. What's hard to find? Pike looked toward the window again. A neighborhood that lets you stay. The decision settled into the room like dust. Cal nodded slowly. Probably the smartest thing you've said since I met you. Later that afternoon, word began spreading across Harlem. Quietly, just like most things in Harlem did. First it appeared in small conversations. At the corner grocery store, inside the barber shop, outside apartment buildings where neighbors gathered to talk. Pike closed his office. You serious? Packed everything up this morning. Just like that. Just like that. And in the Carter apartment, something else happened. Cal Reeves knocked on the door once more. But this time, when Mr. Carter opened it, the conversation sounded very different. Cal removed his hat politely. Afternoon, Mr. Carter stood stiffly. We don't have anything today. Cal shook his head. That's not why I'm here. Mrs. Carter stepped into the hallway behind her husband. What do you mean? Cal handed them the folded page. Mr. Carter opened it slowly. His eyes moved across the numbers. Then he looked up. This says the debt's finished. That's right. Mrs. Carter covered her mouth with one hand. But how? Cal placed his hat back on his head. Sometimes, he said quietly, a man remembers where he's standing. Mr. Carter swallowed hard. Who made him remember? Cal paused for a moment. Then he gave a small smile. You already know. He tipped his hat and walked away down the hallway. Inside the apartment, Mr. Carter sat slowly at the kitchen table. The same table where Raymond Pike had once counted their money. Mrs. Carter sat beside him. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, she whispered one sentence. God bless that man. Across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson walked along Lenox Avenue as the afternoon sun warmed the sidewalks. Walter Gaines caught up beside him. You hear the news? Bumpy nodded. Office closed. Walter smiled. Whole blocks talking about it. Bumpy kept walking. Walter glanced sideways at him. You didn't even have to raise your voice. Bumpy shrugged slightly. Didn't need to. Walter laughed quietly. You know what people are saying? What? That Harlem's safer today. Bumpy looked down the street. Children played stickball near the corner. A shopkeeper waved to a passing customer. Music drifted from a nearby apartment window. Life moving forward again. He adjusted his hat slightly. Harlem's always been safe, he said calmly. Walter raised an eyebrow. Even with men like Pike around? Bumpy stopped walking. For a moment he looked back down the avenue behind them. Then he spoke quietly. Men like Pike forget something. Walter waited. They think power comes from taking. Walter nodded. And? Bumpy's voice stayed calm. Real power comes from protecting. They continued walking as the afternoon stretched toward evening. Behind them, Harlem returned to its rhythm. The barber shop filled with conversation again. Children ran through the streets. Families prepared dinner inside warm apartments. And the Carter family sat together at their kitchen table. The first evening in weeks without fear sitting beside them. The torn page from the debt notebook rested quietly in a drawer. No longer a burden, just a memory. And Harlem remembered something else too. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the simple truth that had been passed through the neighborhood for years. When someone in Harlem was pushed too far, there was a man who eventually knocked on the right door. And when that knock came, things changed. Quietly, permanently, the way real power always did.